Nestor Ivanovich Makhno was a leader of one of the most prominent anarchist movements in history and commander of the Black Army from 1917 to 1921 during the Russian Civil War. Although committed to the cause of revolutionary anarchism and socialism, his image and mythos in modern-day Ukraine sees him as a controversial and disputed figure, even though he really shouldn't be. His status as the commander of an independent anarchist movement in Ukraine, fighting against the forces of the White Army, Red Army, and other Ukrainian groups, mean he is idolized by people across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, and his cause co-opted by various groups. This video examines who Makhno was, misunderstandings about his ideology, and why his status is contested in today's Ukraine. Makhno was born November 8, 1888 in Hulyapol, modern-day Ukraine, which was then the Russian Empire. Born into an impoverished family, he and his brothers worked from a young age to help his family subsist. Following the 1905 revolution, Makhno turned to revolutionary politics, distributing propaganda for the Social Democrats before becoming disillusioned and joining a band of libertarian communists called the Union of Poor Peasants. Makhno spent time in prison and had a death sentence commuted before being finally released in March 1917. The Russian Empire at this time was swept in a wave of revolutionary fervor, and Makhno began organizing an anarchist peasant movement in his hometown of Hulyapol. After Russia capitulated and German and Austrian forces set to occupy territory agreed upon under the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, Makhno worked with Red forces to resist the occupation. He soon set about putting together a militarized and organized anarchist force, linking up with other bands of anarchists to form what became the Revolutionary Insurrectionary Army of Ukraine, colloquially known as the Black Army. Makhno's forces fought against the counter-revolutionary forces of the White Army and Ukrainian nationalists, allying himself with the Red Army and Soviet authorities on occasion. But soon, his autonomous nature presented a threat to Bolshevik authority in the region, and he was stabbed in the back, now finding himself at war with the Red Army as well. His beleaguered and smaller force were defeated by 1921, its remnants fleeing to Romania, with Makhno eventually settling in France, where he would die of tuberculosis in Paris in 1934. During his revolutionary activities, Makhno was utterly committed to the principles of anarchism and communism, and the restructuring of society into one bereft of class and privilege, governed by freely elected councils or Soviets. Now we'll examine why his legacy and status in modern-day Ukraine is so contested and disputed. Although Makhno's political allegiances should be clear to anyone with half a brain cell, this hasn't stopped some political groups in Ukraine from incorrectly and ahistorically appropriating him for a variety of causes. When I initially read about far-right groups co-opting Makhno for their nationalist ideology, I was shocked that something like that would happen. However, as a Westerner, maybe I shouldn't be, as various figures attempt to do the same with George Orwell, portraying him as a conservative and having a very service-level understanding of his politics and worldview. Makhno's resistance to what is perceived as foreign intervention has made him a hero to some Ukrainian nationalists and ultranationalists. His fight against the Red Army and the Bolshevik establishment, who later oppressed Ukrainians, only solidifies this reputation. Since he fought against the Russian Reds, anti-Russian Ukrainians have co-opted his struggle. Following the Maidan in 2013 and Russia's incursion into Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, banners depicting Makhno can be seen flying alongside nationalist and even fascist symbols. Regardless of their actual ideology, historical examples of individuals and organizations have been used from both the left and the right, blurring the lines between ideologies and the meaning of anarchism. Anarchism as a movement in Russia and Ukraine had been demolished and demonized by the Bolshevik administration, to such an extent that it was perceived in very shallow terms, that anarchism simply meant a fight for independence, disorder, crime, or banditry. Very few Ukrainians know what Makhno truly believed in and fought for. Other factors, such as the mishmashing of political labels towards the latter end of the Soviet Union, didn't help matters either. In the late 1980s, those who supported authoritarianism and opposed perestroika were considered right-wing, whilst conservatives like Boris Yeltsin were labelled as left-wing. Popular history pitted Nestor Makhno and Simon Petliura as nationalist allies, even though the two fought one another during the Russian Civil War. Coming from a lineage of Zaporozhian Cossacks, Makhno's legacy has also been co-opted by Cossack groups, and popular memory sits easily with the Cossack myth. A so-called national anarchism began to develop in the wake of this, and the general drift towards nationalism seen throughout the country. Groups like Right Sector, a nationalist and fascist group, have attempted to draw a lineage from Makhno's Black Army to Stepan Bandera's Insurgent Army, a group that collaborated with and fought against the Nazis and was responsible for the genocide of 50 to 100,000 Poles in western Ukraine. In this clip here, you can even see right sector troops on the front lines of Donbass flying a flag that is commonly associated with the Makhnovist movement. Its motto roughly translates as the following, quote, "Death to all who stand in the way of freedom for working people, or working classes." The similar color scheme of the Banderist red and black flag and the red and black banner of anarchist communism only further serves to confuse and obfuscate things. On the other side of the Donbass conflict, there are separatists who also identify with the Makhnovist legacy. The Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which fashion themselves as some weird amalgam of a pro-Russian socialist republic, have many of its supporters waving Soviet flags and other socialist or communist banners. Alexei Mozgovoy, a leader of the so-called Ghost Battalion, one of the separatist paramilitary groups in the region, fancies himself as a mix of both Lenin and Makhno. The question remains, how did these groups and individuals reconcile their nationalism with Makhno's activities during the war? How did they see him as a nationalist when Makhno explicitly denounced nationalism and fought against Ukrainian warlords and nationalists like Simon Petliura? I cannot say for certain, however I imagine it can be attributed in large part due to the right's historical illiteracy. Other explanations can include Nazis and nationalists lacking creative people in their own movement, thus they desire to co-opt others, attempts to repackage their ideology into more acceptable terms, a desire to gain political influence and power, having a coherent ideology or agenda is less important to them, and to confuse and obfuscate symbols, flags, and figures to make it hard for normal people to tell who is on what side of the barricade. While the right are confined to misremembering Makhno and staining his legacy, there are those on the left in Ukraine who remember him the right way. Ukrainian anarchists are a marginal and beleaguered political force in Ukrainian politics, which is dominated largely by right and far-right forces. Ukraine does have a strong anarchist tradition even before Makhno, so it's no surprise his legacy carries on with modern anarchist and libertarian groups. RevDia, short for Revolutionary Action, amongst various other groups, embrace Makhno's legacy, ideals, and slogans as intended, fighting against the far-right paramilitaries like Azov and Right Sector, the Ukrainian state, and even the Russian state, with anarchist, libertarian, and anti-fascist groups fighting on the front lines of the Russo-Ukrainian war today. While Nestor Makhno struggled for a free territory founded on the principles of anarchism and communism, his legacy sees him as a disputed historical figure in post-Maidan Ukraine. Those on the right see him as a nationalist figure and co-opt him for their own banners and slogans, while those on the left try to fight for a world inspired by his principles and ideology. Ultimately, his actions are historical fact and cannot be disputed, but it is interesting to examine how and why people integrate his mythos into their political movements, much like George Orwell, even if it is historically inaccurate. Thanks for watching.